This is a 16-mark question for the Edexcel Medicine Through Time GCSE question. It is one of the two options that you will get for question 5, and it is asking you whether or not you agree with the statement. Okay, and the statement is there was little progress in understanding the cause of disease in the years 1250 to 1700. So if we break down this question, the first thing that we need to do is look at exactly what it's asking us. So little progress in understanding the cause of disease. Okay, so you've got to think about, did people know how illness was caused and spread between these years? So 1250 to 1700. Okay, you're looking at how far. So what that basically means is arguments to support and arguments against. Okay, and then which ones you think is more likely. It's 16 marks, which means it should take you about 24 minutes. It's one of the bigger questions in the paper, so you need to make sure that you leave enough time to answer it properly. And it's giving you 2 bullet points that you can include. So the Great Plague of London and Thomas Sydenham. Like the other answers, you must include information of your own to avoid being capped. So you have to make sure that you include extra information. That can be in the form of 2 paragraphs, or it can be in the form of a number of different points made within smaller paragraphs, like I'm going to show you in just a second. So the first thing that I would recommend is making sure that you revise the content for this question. And thinking about, well, what else could you include within this answer? So I have taken the points that the exam board has given me. We've got the Great Plague and we've got Thomas Sydenham. And I've also thought, well, what other major breakthroughs were made during this time period? Obviously, it's quite a lot of years, and it spans quite a lot of history. So the Black Death is something that I think is pretty fundamental. So I'm including the Black Death as some own knowledge. And I'm also bringing in this idea of the Royal Society, because the main reason that we could say that there wasn't much progress is because the lack of scientific understanding wasn't really there until far later in the period. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is think about your viewpoint. What is your argument? How much do you agree with this statement? So I'm going to say that I mostly agree. Okay, and the main reason that I think that is because there was lack of scientific understanding for a large chunk of the period, and most of the understanding that was there was dominated by religious thought. Okay, remember, medieval England is very religious, and these ideas dominated understanding of illness and disease, and also treatment. Okay, so that is going to form my introduction. So I'm going to say I mostly agree for these reasons. So as you can see, I've got this first section here. Your introduction should be what you think and what will you say. So what points will you make in your answer, and making sure that you summarise your viewpoint. Okay, so that's all going to go in here. You can access this full answer once you've seen the video as well. So if we think about first point, now point is in blue, as usual, evidence in green, and explanation in rainbow. So the point that's being made in the first paragraph is that there's very little progress due to religious explanation for illness. So if we look at the first paragraph that's being written about, primarily diseases were associated with the religious ideas for the majority of the time period. Okay, so we're talking about the whole 1250 to 1700. It's a very religious time in medieval England. The church were hugely influential in medieval England and were vital in assisting with medical care. So these ideas became widespread. Okay, so we're making the point that there wasn't much progress because of outdated religious ideas. Some evidence to support this. Most of the education that people received was provided by the church, so many believed that illness was a punishment from God or a test provided by the devil. Okay, this was reinforced by religious stories and paintings. The most famous disease of this early time period, the Black Death, was mostly explained through religious ideas. Okay, so we're bringing in some extra knowledge here. We're talking about the Black Death. And we're saying that it was widely believed the Black Death was a punishment and spread through miasma or bad air. Many treatments were also religious in nature, such as praying to God for forgiveness or offering gifts. Okay, so we're explaining here that actually this is the reason that scientific progress is being held up at this point, because there is little understanding due to the nature of England at the time. Okay, so we're expanding on this by moving on to point 2. So point 2 is that the church begins to be replaced by government. So as time goes on, the church seems to lack its influence in terms of being able to treat and cure disease. So the paragraph says, most of these ideas continued throughout the following centuries. When the Great Plague of London occurred, a lot of the same ideas were expressed. Okay, so it's really important here. This whole module is about continuity and change. The question is asking you about progress. So what this means is how much continues and how much changes. So this is talking about continuity here. The same ideas were expressed by the 1600s. Some suggested that the alignments of planets were responsible, whilst others believed that miasma had been created from rubbish that had built up in cities. So again, this is an example of continuity, looking at the same ideas for the Black Death 300 years later in a slightly different guise. The belief that the plague was a punishment from God was also expressed. Right, here we are getting into some explanation. There were some developments by the 1600s though. It was clear that diseases could be spread from person to person, so the use of quarantine was introduced to try to stop the rate of infection. The government also replaced the church in their involvement, so this is explanation, we're looking at how things have changed here, in trying to prevent the spread of the plague. They insisted that carts collected bodies daily, some evidence here, and the streets and alleyways were kept clean. This did go some way to preventing the disease spreading, but did not help with understanding of why it occurred. Okay, so this is again another link back to the question, which is asking about progress. We're stopping it spreading, but we're not understanding why it's spreading. Okay, so again, we now move on to the third point, which looks at the beginning of scientific discovery. Okay, so however, by the end of the period, there was some scientific knowledge developing, providing alternative ideas to religious ones. Okay, so this here is now focusing on change. We've looked at continuity, now we're looking at change. The development and increasing popularity of humanism led to more people exploring scientific explanations of how the world worked. Thomas Sydenham, there's our evidence that was given by the question, was significant in this process as he monitored the symptoms of patients to try and work out what disease they had. He concluded there needed to be more focus on treating the disease than the symptoms, which was the previous focus. Okay, if we're being really clever, we can also bring in different aspect of the course. We can reject Galen's for humours idea, and championed the idea that treatments should be developed for the disease and not modified for the individual. Okay, so again, this is coming back to this idea of change. Linking back to the question, this led to a growth of ideas and discussions which were communicated through the creation of the Royal Society. The Royal Society marked a turning point in the study of disease as they focused on delivering scientific ideas to explain illnesses. Okay, and then when it comes to concluding, it's important to kind of sum up what you're saying. So we're looking at, well, there were some changes, but generally there was a lot of continuity. So we've put here in the answer, there was some development, but this didn't really occur until the late 1600s. Okay, and then I'm summing up exactly why that was. So I'm saying that ideas were dominated by religious thought and suspicion, and then there was very little change for the majority of the era. Okay, so that one should take you about 24 minutes to complete, and it's really important to make sure that you keep coming back to the question. So looking at progress, it's asking you how much change is happening during this time period.